has not been made yet. So there's 27 regional tribes which have ancestral ties to Yellowstone, and Yellowstone National Park cultural resource managers and archaeologists consult with those regional tribes on a daily, weekly, monthly basis in order to update them on the goings on with cultural resources, archaeological sites, and other things of interest to Native American tribes. So did all 27 of these tribes live in Yellowstone? I would say most of them did not have traditional territories that overlapped with Yellowstone, but the ones that are shown here, the Shoshone and the multiple bands of the Shoshone that we'll talk about, the Crow, the Blackfeet, Salish Kootenai, Nez Perce, among a handful of others, had traditional territories. More than 20 other tribes had cultural connections. For example, the Kiowa had their origin place at the Mud Volcano in the Hayden Valley. So when did these various Native American tribes arrive to Yellowstone, arrive to Montana, Wyoming? The Shoshone was at least 1,000 years ago, and I think probably more like 10,000 years ago. The Blackfeet arrived to Montana about 2,000 years ago. The Crow emerged out of the Hidatsa tribe about 1,000 years ago, give or take a couple hundred years. The Salish Kootenai and Nez Perce have been in their traditional territories for 10, 11, 12,000 years. So it's in all likelihood that they've been visiting Yellowstone since that time. So what I want to do now, though, is really talk about what the archaeology tells us. So in terms of the origins of Native Americans, the first Native Americans that we see in Yellowstone were the Clovis people. Those can be considered to be the first Americans in Yellowstone. They derived from Asia. They arrived in Yellowstone about 11 to 12,000 years ago. They were big game hunters, but were typical hunter-gatherers in the sense that they would have exploited a whole range of resources in their subsistence pattern, not just animals, but plants and things like that. And were they ancestral to modern tribes? And the answer to that question is yes. This is what is called a Yellowstone prehistoric chronology chart. And this is from your Before Yellowstone book, so you can read it there. I've also posted it as a PDF for you. This basically describes the highlights of different time periods that archaeologists use to characterize the pre-contact period in Yellowstone National Park, starting with the Paleo-Indian period, 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, the early and middle Archaic periods, 8,000 to 3,000 years ago, the late Archaic period, 3,000 to 1,500 years ago, and the late prehistoric period, 1,500 to about the contact period, 200 or 300 years ago. There's projectile points and other types of artifacts that are diagnostic of these different time periods, and I'll expect you to know what those are for each of the time periods. So what today's lecture is going to do is walk you through the earliest period, the Paleo-Indian period, and the origins of the first Native Americans to Yellowstone. So when did they arrive? The earliest Yellowstone archaeological sites are about 11,000 years old. But there's several archaeological sites in the Western United States that are older than 12,000 years old. And I'll talk about what that means for Yellowstone. So in terms of the Clovis Paleo-Indians, there's 2 sites in Yellowstone that tell us that Clovis, those first Native Americans to Yellowstone, were there. There's a Clovis site at Yellowstone Lake and one at Gardner Basin, and we'll talk about those over the course of today's lecture. So Clovis and Yellowstone, the sites are rare. I just talked about 2 sites, but that's of hundreds and thousands of archaeological sites in Yellowstone. Only 2 Clovis points have ever been found. What that indicates is that the Clovis people in Yellowstone probably had very low human populations. This is probably due to the fact that glacial ice sheets covered Yellowstone for much of the time before 11 or 12,000 years ago. Also, because of the melting of those glaciers at the end of the last ice age, about 11,000 years ago, the lakes and the rivers would have been flowing at particularly high levels, making it difficult for hunter-gatherers to get around. So in all regard, travel in Yellowstone would have been difficult until after 11,000 years ago. So that's why I think that Native Americans probably weren't too active in Yellowstone until after that time. So where did Clovis people live? Well, there's been Clovis projectile points and Clovis culture artifacts found in all the United States, the Canadian provinces, and parts of Central America, including Mexico. In the Great Plains, sites are typically at lower elevation river valleys associated with the presence of the big game, megafauna. The oldest Clovis site anywhere in North America is in Mexico, the northern Sonora region. It's a site called El Fin del Mundo, and it's about 11,500 years ago. For all these Clovis sites, the most often type of artifact that are found are megafauna, so mammoths, mastodons, camels, horses, and giant sloths. All these animals went extinct after the last ice age due to environmental change and potentially also because of some human predation. There's very little evidence that much of these megafauna made it up into the Yellowstone region. This is a map that shows the key Paleo-Indian sites. This is in your Montana, your Yellowstone, before Yellowstone book. This shows the location of Yellowstone National Park in relation to the different important early Paleo-Indian sites. So there's 3 important Clovis sites in the region. One's called Wally's Beach in Alberta. Another site is called Colby Mammoth site over by Worland, Wyoming. And then there's the Anzac site in Wilsall, Montana. I'll also talk briefly about the Lindsay Mammoth site in Montana. So the Wally's Beach site is the oldest Clovis site in the northern plains. I talked about El Fin del Mundo, that's in the southern Sonoran Desert region of the American Southwest in northern Mexico. The oldest site up around Montana that dates to the Clovis period is about 11,400 years old, and it shows the evidence of horse and camel hunting by Clovis hunters. That's just across the Montana state border, as you can see up in the southern portion of Alberta. The Colby Mammoth site is over by the Bighorn Basin in Worland, Wyoming. It dates to about 10,800 years ago. There were 7 mammoths and a horse and a camel killed at that site. It was excavated by the famous George Frisson out of the University of Wyoming. So this shows that just east of Yellowstone National Park, Clovis hunters killing those megafauna about 11,000 years ago. The Anzac site's the most important archaeological site in Montana. It's about 70 or 80 miles north of Yellowstone National Park. It dates to about 11,000 years ago as well. It also has the remains of a 2-year-old boy with associated burial artifacts of about 100 stone and bone objects. The important thing about the Anzac site is that the DNA have been studied by Eski Willerslev and his colleagues, and they found that this boy descended from people that migrated from Northeast Asia. So how did Clovis people get to Yellowstone? Based on the Anzac boy and other archaeological evidence, including genetics and artifacts and sites, we know that they arrived from Northeast Asia. Did they walk, or did they possibly take boats and walk? To get to Montana, they most certainly would have had to walk a significant portion of the way. But in order to get down the Pacific coast from Northeast Asia, from Siberia and Alaska, they either would have taken a Pacific coast route along the Pacific rim of the northwestern United States and Canada, or they would have taken the ice-free corridor route, which was just east of the Rocky Mountains from Alaska. The earliest North American archaeological sites, the earliest sites in far northeastern Siberia are between 25 and 30,000 years ago. Once we get out to the Pacific coast, there's several sites. The Monteverde site in Chile is 12,500 years old. The Paisley Cave site in Oregon is 12,300. The Manus Mastodon in Washington is about 12,000 years old. In terms of the interior sites, we have Swan Point in Alaska, also about 12,000. Wally's Beach in Alberta, like the first Clovis site at 11,400. The first Clovis site in the Northern Plains, that is. And then 2 other early sites, the Galt site in Texas, which is older than 12,000 years old, as well as the Page Ladson site in Florida, which is about 12,000 years old. So in terms of human migration routes to Yellowstone, the Pacific coast certainly was the first route that people took. So the older sites are on the Pacific coast. The question is whether or not people came down the Pacific coast and then migrated to places like Yellowstone National Park, like Montana and Wyoming, along the interior river corridors like the Columbia and Snake Rivers, or if they took the interior route from Alaska down the ice-free corridor between Alaska and the Northern Great Plains along the Rocky Mountain front. After Clovis, we know that people arrived. Which route they actually took to get to Yellowstone is still a matter of significant debate. After Clovis, we know that there were some significant events. One was the megafauna extinction at about 10,800, which was the result of human overkill and environmental change. We know that there's very little evidence of Clovis, and the 2 cultures that come after Clovis are called Folsom and Goshen. There's hardly any evidence of those 2 cultures in Yellowstone, although this projectile point right here is a Goshen projectile point that was found in Yellowstone by my crew over by Lewis Falls. So after Clovis, we have Folsom and Goshen cultures, which were bison hunters out in the Great Plains between about 10,500 and 9,500 years ago. But again, there's hardly any evidence of these people in Yellowstone National Park. The first time we see the emergence of people in Yellowstone National Park on a large scale is what's called the late Paleo-Indian period. And that's the Cody culture 9,500 years ago. I've decided not to have that guest lecture. So if you're looking at the slide, I'm excited to see a guest lecture by one of my PhD students, Scott Durson. That's been canceled. I forgot to delete it. Anyway, the Cody culture starts about 9,500 years ago and really marks the emergence of Native Americans in Yellowstone National Park. The Cody culture is considered to be the first substantial Native American culture in Yellowstone, after which many other cultures lived in Yellowstone after 9,500 years ago that I'll talk about in the next lecture. In terms of the key archaeological sites in Yellowstone, the two sites that are considered to be Cody culture sites, this is a map in the Before Yellowstone book, and I suggest that you get familiar with it for the class. This site, the Osprey Beach site and the Fishing Bridge site, are two very important late Paleo-Indian sites that have Cody culture artifacts. So the Osprey Beach site is down at Yellowstone Lake. It was excavated by Brian Reeves out of the University of Calgary and Ann Johnson out of Yellowstone National Park. It's actually the oldest radiocarbon dated site in Yellowstone at this time, at about 9,300 years ago. They found all kinds of really cool artifacts. These artifacts here are called Cody knives, a very diagnostic sort of knife that was used at that time. They also used abraders to straighten their atlatl shafts and also stemmed Cody points to hunt animals. In terms of their subsistence, they relied on a wide variety of animals. Cody culture out on the Great Plains was predominantly a bison hunting culture, but once they came up into the higher elevations of Yellowstone, they hunted a whole variety of game, including bear, deer, bison, bighorn sheep, and all the animals that you'd expect. The Fishing Bridge site is up on the northern end of Yellowstone Lake. That is a site that our crew from the University of Montana excavated. You can see a couple of my crew recording artifacts at this location at Fishing Bridge. We found a whole variety of Cody complex artifacts at this site, and it is on an ancient lakeshore terrace. Back at that time, the lake levels of Yellowstone Lake were significantly higher due to the melting of those glaciers after 11,000 years ago. Since 11,000, 10,000, 9,000 years ago, the water levels at Yellowstone Lake have receded to their current levels. This Fishing Bridge site represents a small Cody culture camp. There's over 20 different types of stone that we found there, basically saying that late Paleo-Indian Native Americans 9,000 years ago or so had very widespread hunting and gathering territories across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The Mailing Creek site was excavated by an archaeological company led by Brian Reeves called Lifeways of Canada in the 1990s. Ann Johnson of Yellowstone participated in that excavation as well. This represents one of the few sites in Yellowstone that shows Cody culture artifacts on the Yellowstone River. It has occupations dating from about 10,000 to 9,000 years ago. And again, for Cody culture in Yellowstone, they hunted a lot of different types of animals and collected a wide variety of plants as well. Bighorn sheep, bear, bison, deer, beaver, marmot, and birds were all part of the subsistence strategy for Cody culture late Paleo-Indians at the Mailing Creek site. So what you have to do next is watch the People of the Hearth movie that's due this Friday, September 23rd. It is about the Barton Gulch site. That's a site near Yellowstone that has late Paleo-Indian artifacts. And it was a movie filmed by Dr. Leslie Davis, former MSU professor who passed away about 10 years ago. This is a late Paleo-Indian site in southwest Montana, about 80 miles northwest of Yellowstone near the town of Virginia City. So watch that movie, and it's due on September 23rd, not September 24th, as it says here. Thanks for watching this video. I'll post another one about the time period after the Paleo-Indian period. And that includes the early Archaic, the Middle Archaic, the Late Archaic, the Late Prehistoric, as well as the Historic Contact period. That'll be lecture part 2 of this